So we have one more speech, but after this talk and after your questions, please don't run away because Chiara has to make an announcement, very important announcement for the rest of the conference. So our last speaker is Francesco Pisano, who hopes not to say too many stupid things.
Always.
He's a research fellow at the University of Naples, Federico, and an adjunct professor at the University of Rome, Niccolo Pisano. He obtained his PhD from the universities of Florence and Wuppertal, writing his thesis on Christoph Hegel. His research focuses on epistemological topics at the intersection of Kantianism, phenomenology, neo-Kantianism, and pragmatism. His current research focuses on the history of logic from the 19th to the 20th century, as well as the relationship between transcendental logic and fictionalism. And I hope I'm not wrong this time with the title. The title of this speech is Only Error is Life. So even if I'm wrong, it's life. And knowledge is dead. Wagner Schiller as a possibility of idealization.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm gonna check your time.
Yeah, we need it for your tabs. Okay, perfect. Good evening. And I'm happy to speak about Fahinger here in this moment because he's a student of Lange, self-declared student of Lange. So I think we made a good plan. So let me start with some general remarks. Schiller's presence in neo-Kantianism can be investigated from two general perspectives. First, there is the way neo-Kantians use Schiller's authoritative figure within their philosophical projects. And second, there is the impact and history of the effects generated by Schiller's peculiar Kantianism within the post-Kantian and neo-Kantian spaces. These perspectives are, of course, intertwined. The interest in recovering and utilizing Schiller's philosophy, as shown by many neo-Kantians, depends on the influences that Schiller and others imposed, embedded in Kantian philosophy at the beginning of the 19th century. So, in this regard, one underlying assumption of my talk today is that this century-long interplay should be contextualized within a tradition that we could call Kantian pragmatism or pragmatic Kantianism. The main representative, I would say, is Christoph Siegwart. I won't speak about this here. But I'm assuming that Schiller contributes to the beginning of a broadly pragmatic interpretation of Kant, and conversely that some inevitable tensions inherent in the development of this pragmatic Kantian tradition in the second half of the 19th century favor the recovery of Schiller as a philosopher within the neo-Kantian context. One of the topics that plays the most for this kind of assumption is the problem of naturalizing transcendental knowledge, or of the quid facti corresponding to the quid iuris transcendental knowledge. And Hans Fahinger's work is inserted in this story. As a kind of general survey, Fahinger's work synthesizes a century of post-Kantian pragmatism within the mature end-of-century form of neo-Kantianism, within institutional neo-Kantianism, so to speak. This is the main reason why an account of Fahinger's reception of Schiller is of crucial importance in a general overview of the neo-Kantian reception of Schiller. Moreover, a well-informed consideration of Fahinger's reception of Schiller sheds some light on how Kantianism and pragmatism can in principle intersect coherently. So, in short, I propose to outline Fahinger's reception of Schiller by defining them, respectively, as the end point and starting point of pragmatic Kantianism, and to clarify the meaning of this tradition by highlighting the way in which both Schiller and Fahinger reinterpret Kant. So, the claim through which I propose to untangle this intertwining is the following. Schiller, for Fahinger, is the figure of a method of idealization grounded in imagination, conceived as an actual psychological activity of a living being. However, this kind of naturalization must be understood not in some simple biological sense, but rather on the grounds of Schiller's ethical perspective on life, which can be summarized in the concept of character, naive or sentimental. So to understand this claim, we must, of course, agree on what idealization means. Hans Feinger made the question of idealization central to this philosophy and inaugurated a discussion that continues today. Since the 80s, we see a new explosion of debates in epistemology about idealization. And so this concept has been, up until today, mainly a monopoly of pragmatists. And so the meaning of idealization appears to us today, in the first instance, as a concept that is pragmatically useful as opposed to true in the sense of truth as correspondence. To say that it is good to proceed by way of idealization, so I'm going to give some examples of idealization. To say that it's good to proceed by way of idealization is to say that sometimes, in thinking about the world, truth isn't what we need. For, as Feinger argued, an idealization is an useful untruth. Insisting upon this point runs against a disciplinary habit of mine. Philosophers have a soft spot for truth, and we can share this affection if we want, and yet hardly anything we ordinarily say is clearly true. Let's consider the case of generalizations, which constantly occur in natural language, just in the sentences I just said. So there are numerous difficulties with the relationships between generalizations and truth. For instance, in the case of the sentence, many philosophers have a soft spot for truth. Who are these relevant philosophers? How many of them must have this soft spot? What exactly makes the sentence of the form X as a soft spot for Y true anyway? The second sentence, we can share this affection, inherits difficulties. What affection is articulated in the first sentence, and so also what we are speaking about in general, but beyond many psychological, cognitive, and transcendental assumptions, idealizations are essentially devices for generalization. Namely, they are devices that allow us to treat generalizations as a kind of affordable judgments, despite the inherent limitations. Feinger agrees with this part of the definition, and therefore, in general, with the pragmatist interpretation of the meaning of idealization. So, an idealization is useful. But he also questions the transcendental constitution of generalizations as ideal objects, that is, idealization as a transcendental process, or the a priori conditions of possibility of the idealizing process. On this point, he is a Kantian, true and true, albeit in a heterodox sense, with respect to Kant's letter, and in any case, in a sense that is not immediately comparable even to his activity as a commentator on Kant's text in his relatively well-known commentary on the Critique of Pure Reason. Therefore, the combination of Kantianism and pragmatism is also, and more specifically in Feinger's case, the combination of idealization as a transcendental process and idealization as a useful logical product. However, we encounter here in the slide the first problem, that is that since right after Kant and all through the 20th century, Kantian transcendental psychology is less and less affordable as a theoretical device. And so we have to somewhat get ourselves in a space that renounces transcendental psychology. And my claim is that Schiller provides such a grounding framework through a realist and vitalist perspective in some way to Feinger, or at least that Feinger interprets Schiller in this kind of vitalist scheme. So here are two quotes from Reinhold and Soson, so I chose to deliberately far quotes to show that this kind of refusal of transcendental psychology is kind of ubiquitous in some way. So we know for sure that Schiller's work had a significant effect on Feinger's work because Feinger himself admits it in his autobiography. He writes, and here I read the quote, not everything you can read, but so I must mention Schiller's poems and treatises, for they too had an important influence on me at that period. As a student reads Schiller and so on, many of Schiller's verses made an indelible impression on me, for instance, the word In error only there is life, and knowledge must be death. This is also the title of the talk. These words, in certain respects, have become the foundation of my theory of fiction. Schiller philosophical treatises were too difficult for me to obtain, but I understood his theory of play as the primary element of artistic creation and enjoyment, and it had a great influence on the development of my thought. For later on, I recognized in play the as if. So the fictionalism as a kind of philosophy of play. And here we can see in this passage that Schiller links Platonism and the theory of fiction to his concepts of life and aesthetic play. There are various reasons to link fictionalism to Platonism, but what interests us is the connection to Plato's theory of ideas. Feinger interpreted this theory as a moment in the history of fiction, thus grounding it again in a kind of psychological, cultural environment rather than in an ontological, metaphysical sense. So the main point here is that, according to Feinger, fictional ideas are produced by processes through real psychological processes and not through some sort of transcendental subjectivity. So we have our addition of influence, we have the naturalized idea in Feinger. So what is the problem? The problem is that Feinger writes a lot, but he mentions Schiller relatively few times. Compared to the importance, the declared importance of Schiller's Feinger's Schiller in Feinger's framework, the quotations are really scarce, both in the philosophy of as if and in the commentary, and therefore we found ourselves in the difficult position of having to justify Feinger's words in his autobiography concerning the relevance of Schiller, and also my claim about the relevance of Schiller to understanding the pragmatist struggle of neo-Kantianism, which is such a scant number of direct mentions. So here's how I will try to do this. The main part of the talk is a survey of Feinger's mentions of Schiller, roughly chronological. After that, I will try to highlight some problems and topics from these quotations, and then reframe them in Feinger's fictionalism and then in Schiller's philosophical treatment of poetry. So Feinger's references to Schiller can be grouped in three categories, roughly. The first concerning Schiller's role in the history of German poetry, and here the main term of confrontation is Goethe. The second group concerning Schiller's interpretation of Kant philosophy, and we talked a lot about this today. And the third group about Schiller's pragmatist, fictionalist, play-focused approach to aesthetic and ethical ideals. So at first glance, we can already see that the second group are strictly intertwined, and they appear to be of greater interest to the question of idealization. I will return most to the first group, but let me start with the with the second group. And in his early book about Hartmann during Lange, 1876, Feinger writes that the recognition of the subjective origin of both causality and matter, as well as teleology and idea, alone makes the miracle of reconciliation possible. Without attributing reality in the common sense of the world of ideas, one should, with Schiller, the enthusiastic Kantian, enter into it with free spirit, as into the true home of the spirits, into the land of thought of free, eternal, divine beauty, to drink aesthetic satisfaction from it. So clearly the reconciliation Feinger is talking about here is between nature and ideas, of nature and freedom. We were speaking before about the third antinomy. And what he's saying here is saying that the attitude of the free spirit, the attitude of reconciliation, is the attitude that derives aesthetic satisfaction. Kantian dichotomies are resolved in this satisfaction that is not through a logical or epistemological grounding, but insofar as their oppositional configuration produces aesthetic enjoyment. In light of Lange's interpretation of Schiller, such aesthetic enjoyment cannot be considered an end in itself, rather it is functional to an ethical, practical moment. So this is not the earliest mention of Schiller in Feinger's work, but I will come to an earlier mention later. But in the philosophy of as if, Schiller, Feinger quotes Lange at length. One of the mentions I chose is this one, because the ethical practical moment on which I'm talking about is the core of Kant that Schiller preserves and the core of Schiller that Feinger preserves to Lange. So the quote from Lange goes like this: Schiller made the intelligible world visible to the senses, and he grasped the innermost kernel, the ethical kernel of the Kantian doctrines. He did so by treating it poetically. He follows Plato's footsteps. So Schiller opened to us the realm of the ideal in following Plato's footsteps. This quote is taken from the second edition of the History of Materialism, 73-75. Feinger's comment that the sensualization of the ideal, the connection of idealization to actual sense-related and psychological facts, can only take place at the cost of adopting a different standard of truth. This is Feinger speaking. In order to, so he's saying that if we have to take Lange seriously, we also have to pose an epistemological question, not only an ethical one, because we have to find a different standard of truth to justify Lange's claims about Schiller and Kant and the kernel of Kantianism. So, in order to search for this different standard of truth, Feinger needs to modify Kant in some way and also Schiller, and that's what he does in the following quotations. They are a bit long, but I highlighted the parts which I want to read to you. So there is the distinction. So Feinger is commenting on what Schiller is saying about the Goethean Urpflanze, and Feinger is saying that Schiller claims that the Urpflanze or the Urtiere, the original animal, the original plant, they are just ideas, in the sense that they are just fictions. They are imaginary, and they do not correspond, they cannot correspond to any possible experience. That is, no empirical intuition can correspond to them. So they are imaginary, but they do not correspond to any possible experience. And Feinger is attributing this perspective to Schiller. So he's already saying that Schiller was the first post-Kantian fictionalist. So Feinger comments that here Schiller wants to say that we cannot have an experience of the original plant, but nevertheless the original plant is a useful representation produced by the subject, and it is the result of a creative processes possibly attributed to an imaginative capacity. So here is a bit about Goethe's Urpflanze, but just to have some context, we have to understand that here Feinger, in commenting Schiller, that comments about the Urpflanze, is using Schiller in some ways to take a stance against Goethe, because Goethe himself took a stance about science that was markedly anti-Kantian when he spoke about the Urpflanze, namely anti-mechanistic and anti-Newtonian. And this, so the debate about the Urpflanze between Schiller and Goethe, in Feinger's mind, is kind of a theater between the Kantian and the Spinozian in some way, because Goethe in this context interprets the part of the Spinozian. But this comes at cost, this kind of representation. In Feinger's perspective, Kantian ideas seem to be entirely reduced to artistic and poetic creation, and thus to products of the empirical imagination, not transcendental one. However, we must note that if in Kant's framework, in Kant's orthodox framework, so to speak, imaginary beings are different from the nihil negativum, the nothingness, the complete nothingness. Here, the table of nothingness at the end of the Amphiboli, in the Critique of Pure Reason, and we clearly see that Kant distinguishes the ens imaginarium from the nihil negativum. That's because if we have to imagine, if we must be able to imagine something, this must conform, at least to a minimum standard, to space and time, to the pure intuitions of space and time, while the circle square cannot conform to this kind of conditions, and thus it is a nil negativum, not an ente imaginarium. So what kind of objects are fictions? They are imaginary objects or nil negativum. I'm gonna stop for now about Feinger and Kant. Let's move forward to Feinger and Schiller. The most important document in this regard is the special issue of Kant's Studien in 1905, from which also the essay by Bruno Baug we spoke about this morning was drawn. So what it's interesting for me in this journal issue is that amongst the many themes and amongst many essays on transcendental philosophy, Feinger chose to work on the anthropological roots of Schiller's thought, namely on the Carl Friedrich Abel's dissertation De Characteris Animi in the Karl Schüler. So a dissertation in empirical psychology, in the psychology of character. So why does Feinger, in the centenary of Schiller's death, choose to focus on Schiller's anthropology? That is, my claim about this is that character is actually important in Feinger's interpretation of Schiller. I was saying before that Goethe represents a kind of Spinozist naturalist realism. This kind of perspective is actually something very present in Feinger's time. He needs to confront and weaken the position of naturalist, positivist contemporaries, like main name is Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel as a philosophy, which is named monism, has a clear Spinozian Goethean lineage, a clear anti-Kantian lineage, and Feinger, as a defender of Kantianism, must find a way to naturalize the transcendental that avoids collapsing into monism. He must keep the dualism between idea and nature open without losing any of them and without collapsing into monism. So that's the problem, and that's the way he tries to. That's why it becomes important for him to focus on what we could name the most naturalistic part of Schiller's philosophy, namely his philosophy of character. So this is a summary of my survey. My conclusion from the first part of the talk was the biggest one, don't worry. We find that Feinger sees in Schiller an attitude similar to that of fictionalism, namely a naturalized perspective on idealization, where this naturalization is represented by the tie to imagination as an actual psychological activity. And then he sees in his own context a Kantian possible response to the demand for monistic positivistic naturalization, Spinoza, Goethe, Haeckel. So now this is what Feinger wants to do, in my opinion, with Schiller. Does he do it? To discover this, we have to do a little bit of ABC on Feinger's fictionalism. This is just a quotation from the philosophy of Vasile, and where it's clear that fictions are intended as psychological mental structures. They are representations in the sense of empirical acts of the mind and objects produced by imagination. And that is because Feinger is also strongly influenced by Darwin, and he sees fictions as an adaptive means of orientation in a hostile environment. So he needs to think about fictions as real psychological products for real, actual living beings that need to survive in an environment. This is also Sigvart's influence, by the way. So that's what he needs to do with fictions. I'm gonna skip a few elements, but I just want to underline the difference that many of you already know between real fictions and semi-fictions. So semi-fictions are kind of what we could name Galilean abstractions. So models that are not real, but they resemble reality, while the real fictions, and the most striking part of Feinger's theory of fictions, they are self-contradictory. They are impossible to think about. So the main example is the atom. a body that is not extended is essentially self-contradictory for Feinger's part. While, for instance, the most important example of semi-fiction is the Adam Smith rational agent, or even either Flanze or Linnaeus classification. Both semi-fiction and real fictions can and need to be scientific fictions if we need to do science with them. They have to be, some of them, they need to be good tools for prediction, according to Feinger's way of seeing science as a kind of organized prediction of the future. And so a scientific fiction must be used consciously as a tool with the awareness that it is not real, but it must also have a kind of predictive power. So now the problem becomes both a psychological and a logical one. Because if we think about fictions as real psychological processes, then real fictions become very problematic. Because how can we imagine something that is self-contradictory? So remember the difference between ente imaginarium and nel negativum I highlighted before. But if they are not psychological at all, they are only logical, then their adaptive power, their contextual value in a hostile environment becomes null. So we can summarize this both problem, both the psychological and the logical one, by saying that we need predictions that are false, but in a different sense. So for Weinger, predictions are false, not in the sense that they are not true, they are not correspondent to reality. They are errors. They are not, so truth in itself, as the idea of correspondence between thought and being, is the most expedient error. It's a kind of postulate we create to think that our thoughts can and must conform to something external to it. Actually, according to Weinger, there is nothing external to thought beyond chaotic sensations. So the idea of truth is in itself a fiction, and fictions are false, not in the sense that they are not true, not correspondent to a reality, but they are erroneous practices. They are behaviors, or they express themselves in behaviors that consciously deviate from a standard in order to find some new prediction, so to speak. So the idea is that if we assume this kind of idea of fiction as error versus fiction as the false product of imagination, then we can make sense of the way Weinger speaks about them, beyond the logical, epistemological problem I just outlined. So what does this mean for Schiller's idea of idealization as a kind of imaginary activity? It is abandoned. I don't think that this is necessary, because also in Weinger, and I'm moving on to the last part of the talk, we have a kind of psychologism that deviates from its most fallacious consequences. We have a kind of ethical historical conception of psychological character, and thus of imaginative artistic activity. The most important passage on this subject can be found in the essay on naive and sentimental poetry, where Schiller writes that, and here I'm going to deviate from what has been said before me, because it's been repeated 2 times, that the main merit of Schiller was that he allowed us to go beyond nature in some way. But for me, the point is rather that Schiller's idea of idealization also highlights that we need to preserve the nature we overcome. It is not a monopoly of the sentimental character, of the simply idealizing character. We must find an equilibrium between the naive, so to speak, nature-tied character and the naive, idea-focused character, and the sentimental genius himself is exposed to the danger of Schwärmerei, of daydreaming, of going beyond any possible humanity of what he poses in imagination. So I think that Schiller's merit is rather imposing a kind of more balanced idea of idealization, at least in relation to nature. So transcending the nature of the ideal, the nature towards the ideal, but bringing nature with us and preserving it. This is the ethical aesthetic purpose that Schiller ultimately assigned to art. And idealization that does not start from nature is doomed to be abstract and one-sided, because nature is a starting point, at least in terms of the character that is naturally naive or sentimental. I am naturally naive and naturally sentimental, and I am an idealizing subject. I'm not a transcendental subject in general, but I'm an actual man with character in some way. So the factual individual psyche must be transcendent, but it cannot be transcendent simply by abstracting from it, because abstracting itself is a real process. Hence, this is also in Schiller's perspective. Hence, in certain fundamental respects, it conforms to the limits and characteristics of the subject undertaking it. So the naive subject will idealize in a certain way, the sentimental subject will idealize in another way. In other words, the Kantian transcendental subject, unique and universal, is replaced here by a subject endowed with a character, and in this sense, naturalized. However, this naturalization does not primarily concern its being a contingent fact, a biological activity, but rather its being an ethical, active character. So, consequently, achieving a perfectly balanced measure of idealization seems to remain a fiction. I'm driving to a close. So, it seems to be impossible to achieve a perfectly balanced measure of idealization, since the idealizer is always either naive or sentimental. This is true, this impossibility, first and foremost in a logical and epistemic sense. It is not possible to obtain knowledge of what lies beyond the antinomies of experience without collapsing into ephemerei if we are not careful and if we do not remain human, and that we bring nature with us in our poetry making activity. Schiller writes concerning idealization that if we go towards an idealization that runs counter to any possible experience, we already lost the point of this operation. Human nature would have to be altogether abandoned, and thus also the ethical element of idealization. And then, funny to me that he says that the pure idealization becomes nonsense, and nonsense is exactly Feinger's real fiction, is a self-contradiction. This is in short of the meaning of Schiller's peculiar historical ethical theology concerning idealization. So I'm now summarizing. In short, Feinger draws from Schiller, also through Lange, a notion of idealization that is both pragmatic and psychological, or psychologistic if you want, framing it within a non-metaphysical interpretation of Kant's theory of ideas. Feinger declares this source, but at the same time conceals it in some way, because the psychological naturalism and the realism implicit in it, so the idea that there is a real character at the start of idealization, betrays the skeptical assumptions of fictionalism, namely that there is no real nature beyond subject sensations. On the other hand, the naturalistic psychologism in question in Schiller is not a trivial naturalism, but an original reading of the fact of the psychological activity essentially as an ethical and historical fact, that is, as a character. If this ambiguity of idealization, so central to Feingerian fictionalism, does not compromise its overall validity, so if you accept that this kind of defense I try to make about the coherence of using Schiller in an anti-realist perspective in Feinger fictionalism, even with the realist and naturalist element of character, it is because the fictionalism itself does not mean to present itself as a scientific theory in a proper sense, not as a classical philosophical theory at least, not as a mirror of nature, but as an instrument of orientation and adaptation within a chaotic sensory environment. So, and allow me to conclude quoting Feinger again. This time Feinger is speaking about Nietzsche, but he could also have been speaking about his own version of Schiller. Thus, I agree with the idea of continuity until Nietzsche of a certain strand of Kantianism. I don't want to assume position about its correctness or not. But what Feinger says is that the world of being is an invention. There is only the world of becoming, and it is because of this invented world of being that the poet regarded himself also as being and contrasts himself with it. So the poet invents poet itself invents truth, invents the realm of the ideal. Being is consequently a product of thought. Substance is an error. Nietzsche says, quite in the Kantian tradition, and I think here Henger grasps the point, that the royal prerogative which we assume after the manual of artists prides itself on having created this world. And that was it. Thank you.
Well done. We are actually right at time, so we already have a question.
Yes, Sama, thank you very much for this interesting talk. I understand that you focus on idealization, very possible, but you also use a lot of times, both with regard to fire and Schiller and Kant, the concept of idea. And I wonder if you could relate this meaning of idea that you work with here to come, because I mean, you know, people of pure reason, the ideas only regular function. They concern, so to say, the organization of understanding. Well, understanding is conceptualized in categories. They are not conceptual but empirical concept, right? As let's say, conceptual information concept of information. So you come up with the example of the artifact plan that would be the biggest of empiricals. In practical reason, these are those information. Maybe you would say, well, you talk about the conceptualization as a result of reason, some ideas, the conceptualization of reason, the person formation. But then you speak, that can only make sense about the consequence. It is very broad meaning of reason, as of say the whole of our higher categories, and not this very specific use that related to, so to say, these speculative ideas. So I think for me at least it would be very helpful if you could relate the store of idea to come.
Yeah, thank you. So I actually wrote about this, about Feinger's relations to Kant and the kind of distortions he makes. So the first thing I think we have to understand is that in Feinger we do not have the distinction between regulative and causative no more, because we don't have a transcendental psychology. We only have a norm, that is the fiction, that orders chaotic sensations around some kind of empty center, that is the self-contradictory real fiction. So the distinction collapses in Feinger's perspective. Clearly, in Kant's perspective, this does not collapse. We also have a distinction between the ideal of pure reason, the ideal of practical reason, and then the ideas. I will not try to explain this stuff from all over again, but I will just say that this topic was the key of kind of trying to salvage metaphysics from post-Kantian perspective. So what also Paolo and Chiara talked about, the movement towards the artistic and then the ethical practical of the metaphysical topic, it's a process that I think happens during all the second half of the 19th century, but it comes at the cost of kind of weighing heavily on regulative functions, because regulative functions no more, their function becomes not more only to become a unity, a general unity of multiplicity of phenomena. It becomes also kind of that of giving ontological dignity to the object that is individuated by this regulative direction. So while I think that this kind of debate is develops all through 19th century, and that it's surely for, I'm sure that Kant, so I don't know, I think that Kant will not have approved it, even if in the Opus Posthumum there are some elements about this. But for sure, Feinger's, he also notices it in the commentary. So in the commentary is very much more of a legitimate interpreter, and I think, and he says that in the commentary there is this kind of distinction. He does not arrive to the dialectic because he does not write the fourth volume, but he says that his own fictionalism has to deviate from this kind of standard. Prego.
Yeah, two more questions.
Possibile non in italiano, magari lo italiano.
I will translate if you want, yeah.
Anche più che altro bell'intervento molto informativo, perché più che altro una curiosità, cioè se Feinger si confronta anche con il concetto schilleriano di grazia, per infinità, te lo chiedo perché di poi caso mi sembra che la sua interpretazione, come dire, faccia meno gioco, diciamo così, la sua interpretazione di Schiller. Lo dico perché un autore invece come Fischer, nella sua ricostruzione storica, come dire, si sofferma su grazia e dignità come una sorta di opera che al tibio, diciamo così, che non è ancora l'estetica dell'uomo, è già però già un primo distacco diciamo, dal caritismo, se vogliamo, più preso alla lettera, diciamo così, in maniera molto impropria. Diciamo. No, soltanto questo sostanzialmente. E quindi se non ti sembra che Finder un po', come dire, enfatizzi soprattutto un aspetto riflessivo di libertà, sicuramente una base sessuale, però appunto come poi questo appiglio se c'è davvero nelle opere schilleriane.
I will translate shortly the question, which actually concerns Anmutungyöle, or Schiller, so grace and dignity, I think, in English, because Sabato, of course, refers to Fischer, who actually detects, in this work, kind of turning points from Kantism towards the new phase and towards the aestheticiancy. So the question is how Fayeka sees the same work.
Okay. Okay, so as far as I know, Feinger does not mention Arnold Würde. Generally, he only mentions poetry from Schiller. That's, I think, interesting. He very rarely mentions the essay writings of Schiller, namely, especially on naval sentimental poetry, but not much more than that. He often mentions the Xenien with Goethe, so the poetry that also makes fun of Kant in some interesting way. But so if I have to answer your question on a more conceptual level, I would agree that On Grace and Dignity puts Feinger much more in difficult position when he tries to ascribe Schiller to himself, so to the fictionalist position. But I would also claim that Feinger never. So Feinger does this operation with all the history of philosophy. He writes extensively from Plato to Lange, and he reads everything through the lens of fiction. He never claims that his own interpretation is systematic or is the only possible true interpretation, but he kind of reasons in finding traces of fictionalism in authors. And also, this is the case of Schiller too. So he would probably reply that he did not mean to take the whole of Schiller with himself, but only the parts in which Schiller recognizes what he thinks is the kind of an empirical fact. That is that we, in philosophy and science, every day we make use of fictional concepts. So yeah, I would answer it like that. In general, the more metaphysical and the early Schiller is less ignored. You have like so metaphysical in the sense of basing on a sort of absolute transcendent truth beyond what is the actual praxis of the poet and so on. So Feinger focuses on the last part.
We have one more.
I had some meetings in 5 minutes ago, and Schiller is everything what you said is my correct. I want to add another point because the narrative of mindfulness with you. Anything he was an editor of his own book. There was a discussion about the blindness and said no, the book was already finished. This was my publication. 40 years ago, and so on. And then you have the whole narrative from the series Philosophie der Zerstreckung in 1921. And there's I'm the inventor of the philosophy as is, but there are a lot of foreigners, and all the foreigners are not in the canon of philosophy. So I didn't read Goethe and Schiller. I didn't even speak Schiller, no? And I didn't read Lotze, I read Darwin. So here's all this narrative about self-education. I think it's fantastic. Not true, yeah.
No, completely false, yeah.
But it should became a reference for this process of self-education.
Yeah.
Normally, you don't read Schiller, philosopher. But if you read Schiller, you are guided to excellence.
Yeah.
So, would you agree? And this is convenient with what you said about Schiller's section?
I obviously agree with, so it's kind of textually true that so Feinger says this, and he also does this telling of himself as a kind of heterodox character. There is the passage quoted. He claims that he read Schiller when he was an high schooler. So Schiller for a German is like Manzoni for an Italian, is like popular literature at the end of the century. And then he says that he has also a special link to him through his family and so on. But yeah, so we have to start with the claim that it's obviously not true, that he did not read Hegel and other, like the major canon. But the main merit, so I agree with this, and the main merit is in producing some sort of minor canon of some sort of second phase of German philosophy throughout the century. He also does this with Lange in the Hartmann during Lange. He tries to always to find himself in a kind of heritage, even if he says I am the inventor of this, as if. For me, what is, if I may add, since I agree, I just made a comment. Schopenhauer, the philosophers that were Schopenhauerians, like von Hartmann, they were like mortal enemies of Feinger at this point. For me, it's interesting that he also tried to took Schopenhauer and in his own heritage, because there is a significant strife in those years. So Schopenhauer was the representing figure of the political quietism and pessimism, while Feinger was the star of the rising neo-Kantian moderate movement. So I think that every operation that Feinger does in this sense is a kind of canonization, and thus a political operation in some ways, operation of cultural policy. And Schiller completely enters into it, even on the grounds of 50 years of neo-Kantian reappropriation of Schiller. But I would say that the main feature of Schiller's originality is that he inserts Schiller while recovering it as philosophers in this kind of minor. So he would not agree that Schiller is a bridge between, for instance, Kant, Fichte, and then Schelling and Hegel. He would say that it's more of a friend of Schopenhauer and perhaps of Fries and Herbart. Thank you.
No more questions from you? We are done. Do you want to make your announcement? Your final announcement?
Thank you.